Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this NZ US Council live session with Evan Osnos. I'm joined by Leon Grice, Chair of the Council. Welcome, Leon.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. And really looking forward to this session with Evan. I know he has been extremely busy over, the last month or so, providing analysis on the election and insights into the subject of today's conversation. Of course, the new president, well, soon to be new President-elect Joe Biden, and like I said, the subject of his latest book, Joe Biden: The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now. I've just finished reading it just last night. It's a wonderful read. Yes, incredibly well written, and just very accessible. So it's a quick read. You come away with this very clear sense of the character of the man, and really recommend you go out and buy it.
How's the sales going, Evan?
Going okay. Please do so.
But definitely put it on your summer reading list, your beach reading. Definitely worth the read. But let us get into it and hear from Evan. First, quick introduction first. We'll of Evan's bio. He is a staff writer at the New Yorker and a fellow at the Brookings Institution based in Washington, D.C., where he writes about foreign affairs and politics. He's the author of Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth and Faith in the New China, which won the 2014 National Book Award and was based on 8 years of living in Beijing, where he was New Yorker's China correspondent from 2008 to 2013. As mentioned, his most recent and timely book provides a concise examination of President-elect Biden based on lengthy interviews with Biden and on conversations with more than 100 of Biden's circle, including President Barack Obama, Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, and a range of progressive activists, advisors, opponents, and Biden family members. Evan, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
I think Jordan missed out that he's also a fanboy and has been following you when he was living in China and was following all your analysis from back then.
Yes.
Nice to hear that. Thanks.
Yeah, big fan. I think you were leaving around the same time as I arrived in 2013. But I do recall you doing a lot on Fareed Zakaria's GPS.
Yeah, it's true. Well, the thing about China, I have to say, the great pleasure of it as a place to live, place to visit, is that whenever you arrive, you always think that you're there for the most interesting chapter of history. So I'm sure that you probably looked at us poor saps and said, oh, they left at exactly the wrong time. They missed out on all the good stuff.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I arrived 2013 when President Xi was just taking up the reins of power. So you're exactly right. But the place I want to start is by looking at your book. So Joe Biden: The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now. And the question is, why this book now after nearly 50 years in public life? Joe Biden, what is it we don't know about him? How well do we understand Joe Biden?
No, I have to say, it's a really interesting question because, in many ways, I think a lot of us think we know who this man is, or at least we think we know all we need to know. For some people, they were satisfied with the knowledge that he was running against Donald Trump. That's what they cared about. For others, it was the fact that he was from shall we say, the sort of center-left part of the Democratic Party. He wasn't from the most progressive end of the party. There were a lot of reasons why people sort of put him into certain categories. And I had this unusual encounter with him, actually, over the years, which is to say that I came to Washington in 2014, and having lived overseas at that point for a decade. And I was focused on foreign affairs and politics. And so I said, okay, I want to go talk to the people who are doing the most on foreign affairs and national security. And that led me to his office. And what was notable about it was he was not a hard appointment to get because people weren't paying very much attention to Joe Biden. I mean, the reality was that, the vice presidency is considered a kind of second tier job. And he was part of the political furniture. People felt like they knew him. And what I discovered, and to be blunt about it, to tell a bit of story on a bit of embarrassing truth about myself, I didn't particularly know my way around town yet in Washington. I'd barely been here. And all the cool reporters were spending time with others, paying attention to others. But I thought this Biden character seemed quite interesting. And what was really notable to me was once I went and spent time with him, is that he couldn't help himself but to tell you interesting things about American political culture. He's just, as you all know, I mean, he is by his nature sort of improvisational and rather ungoverned in what he chooses to say, not in the same way as Trump. That's a whole different thing. But he just doesn't plot out every syllable. And I'll give you one very good example. In 2014, I was sitting in his office, actually, at the West Wing, and he started talking about how he said the Democratic Party is making a big mistake. It is not recognizing the anger that's boiling up from the working class. And this is before Donald Trump was on the scene. It was before Bernie Sanders had emerged as a political phenomenon. Joe Biden was onto something. He has, after 48 years in politics, a pretty good sense, a fingertip feel for the political mood. And I kept going back and back and back. And that was the beginning of this long-running chronicle, in a sense. And what I concluded by the end, having talked to him about all of these chapters of his life and talked to all the people around him, was that there was, in fact, a much richer story there than we usually would convey in the shorthand political reporting. And it needed a book.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about that example of he was on to what was happening. And throughout the book, you refer to, he's this very, he's an astute analyst, what's happening, but he's the weather vane for the center of the Democratic Party. And I know, I think I just read that bit you were talking about in the book where he taps into, before Trump does, the economic case and the plight of the worker. And you leave it out of your article at the time because you sort of dismiss it as a boilerplate from Biden. But can you talk to us a little bit more about that role he performs as the weather vane for the Democratic Party, and where does that come from?
Yeah, that's one of the really important themes, I think, for us to keep in mind as we prepare for 4 years or more or less of Biden presidency, is that he moves over time. And this is the kind of thing that in politics sometimes the political press will punish a politician for taking one position and then taking a different position a few years later. Biden's not ultimately all that concerned about that. You see, a couple of the sort of prime examples of recent years have been that he was one of the people who endorsed gay marriage before President Obama got there. And at the time, I think people out in the general public looked at that and thought, oh, well, maybe that's just a classic Joe Biden kind of gaffe, as they say. But in fact, that was the product of genuine calculation and realization of where the public was. I mean, he got it. And if you go back over the course of his career, this is a product, I think, to your question, this is like one of the things that's interesting is where does this come from? It's a product partly of the fact that he came from this place in the United States that was very much divided between the North and the South. Delaware is such an interesting microcosm of all of these elements that were in some ways cosmopolitan New York-like, and in other ways, it was still a Jim Crow state when he was growing up. There was still discrimination against African Americans. In fact, I mean, one interesting detail is that African diplomats who were going from Washington to New York, driving through essentially the North, were finding that they were subject to discrimination when they passed through Delaware. So he came up as a senator in this place where he had to figure out a way to meet all of these different elements of his constituency. And that constituency was also evolving and changing. So he started his career, in fact, before he even got into the Senate, he was actually on the side of civil rights. He'd run for office, having participated in some of these integration protests, desegregation protests in Delaware, but then found once he was there that he was getting beaten up by white suburban parents who were not in favor of busing in the schools. They didn't want to have African-American kids bust into white schools. And so he, in reflection of his constituency, he moved into that position for a while. Now, of course, over the course of his career, he takes some pride in having then eventually, helped the first Black president succeed in office. But that is an example of how you see, as the Democratic Party has moved and changed, so has he. And where does that put us now? I think what's interesting about that is one of the reasons that he is in this position is because he does not get too far out ahead of where the party is. Had he done that, he probably wouldn't have won the primary. And yet at the same time, he has to be alert to the fact that it's going to change over the next 4 years. It's getting younger. It's getting more liberal. It just is. And one of the things you see in his cabinet appointments is an attempt to try to navigate all of those cross currents.
I think that's a really fascinating insight. Policy wonks and analysts love grunty policy and politicians to have great strategic ambition. But it seems like, what's come through from your analysis is that he has, empathy in spades, but he also has the political craft to actually understand how working class people are feeling, and to get those signals earlier than other politicians. It's an interesting contrast with Hillary Clinton, who wasn't able to demonstrate that.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, what's interesting about him is that he comes quite seriously from this place in American history in which he is acutely conscious of those elements of class and opportunity. I mean, his father, as is often the case, when I analyze Chinese politics, I'm thinking about the fathers and the sons and the mothers and the daughters. This sort of patrimony of ideas. And in Biden's case, it's very important too, because his father was this figure who had grown up with elements of great wealth. In fact, there were sort of remnants of it in his family story. But they were basically gone. His family had a kind of failed business venture. And as a result, his father grew up with this very acute sensitivity to any slight, anybody telling him that he was no good or that he wasn't up to the standard. He had this moment. I always think of this as kind of a telling moment that his father at that point had gone into selling cars, and they were at a Christmas party, and the owner of the car dealership tossed a bucket of silver dollars out on the floor and let the staff kind of scurry after them, picking them up. This was sort of supposed to be festive. And Biden's father was so offended by that he took his wife's hand and they walked out of the party, and he was fired for doing so. But he had this very acute sense of the dignity of work, that there should not be something humiliating in your economic life. And his son picked up on that. And one of the themes that you hear that is very consistent through his politics over the last 50 years has been this awareness that work is kind of about more than a paycheck, and that you have to figure out ways to make people feel as if they're not being humiliated when they get up and go out the door every day.
Yeah, so you talk about Biden not really having a set sort of ideological play. He's certainly seems to be a very self-reflective individual. What's his guiding line in terms of governance, or what's his guiding line?
So I'll say two things. That's a really interesting way to frame it. There's two things that are important to keep in mind. One is he is actually curiously more ideological than we think. It's just that his ideology is centrism, which is actually a substantive idea, because it doesn't just mean that you go where anybody tells you to go. I mean, his friend, the great Congressman Jim Clyburn, who after all was a pretty important reason why Biden won the presidency. You'll remember Jim Clyburn is a congressman from South Carolina, the longest serving African American in Congress. And he he is somebody who calls himself a centrist. And he gets criticized by younger activists who say, why would you call yourself a centrist? You should call yourself a liberal, call yourself something else. He says, no. He says, because in American politics, in our history, we tend to go to the extreme one after another. But that means that we pass through the center every time, and we spend twice as much time in the center as we do at either extreme. And that's why I'm a centrist. And he and Biden have that very much in common. And I think, if you want to define what Biden's governing idea is, it's that he basically believes that a lot of the vitriol on the extremes of our politics, that they do not reflect what he believes is the basic ballast at the center of American political culture. We may be a little more center left than we are center right at any given moment, but that we are not, in fact, the shrillest voices out on either end of the spectrum, that's not a real reflection. And that was his belief in this primary. And it's worth reminding ourselves, he was the most conservative member of the Democratic field out of 27 Democrats to run. He was certainly the oldest. But he had a piece of data at the heart of his campaign. And that data said that most Democrats today describe themselves as either moderate or conservative Democrats. They don't describe themselves as progressive or liberal. And most of them are over the age of 50. And so Joe Biden knew where the field was. He knew where the electorate was. Frankly, he knew it a lot better than I think people in my profession did, and a lot of his opponents.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you raised, because when you look at all of the press commentary, the U.S. has never been more divided. It's never been a more bitter election. And as a Kiwi who has lived in the US, I spent a lot of time sort of saying, the US, this experience of living in the US is not captured by the thin straws of looking through CNN or Fox. And most Americans you speak to, they don't say very few of them will say they're an extreme Democrat or an extreme Republican. Most of them are actually in the center, but yet it's being presented in the media. So maybe Biden had that instinct all along and held to that, which is why he's now president-elect.
Yeah, I think he did capture something. There's a bit, Leon, what I think is interesting, there's also there's always a bit of there's what we aspire to be and what we want to be in our self-narrative. We want to be that centrist nation that finds it within ourselves. And then there are those moments like the one we're going through right now, which could only be described, using Philip Roth's great term, which was the great American berserk. I mean, we are really we are, in fact, at this moment where the boxers have gone into their corners and we're squaring off against one another. What I think is that what you captured rightly, and I think what Biden believes too, is that those moments do come and go, but there remains this underlying organizational idea. Now, the challenge for him, and it's a really serious one, is that he's contending with a set of instruments of information and politicization and polarization that are new. I mean, there are some through lines in politics that have been more or less the same for 250 years in this country, and then there are pieces of it that are genuinely new agents. And I think the power of our splintered news media, the power of social media, the power of this kind of strange, soupy combination between disinformation and news. And I have to put, things like Newsmax and One America News Network in there. Those are not, just the honest answer, they're just not news organizations in any recognizable way. I'm not being, partisan here. It's just, I'm describing the discipline of a profession. We're now dealing with things that he's going to have to deal with that are different than what John F. Kennedy was dealing with when he took office, one of Biden's inspirations.
It's a problem to be solved because his message won an election, but it doesn't make money for the cable networks, and it doesn't make money for Facebook and Google, because you need outrage to run those things.
Yeah, and I think I often look at things these days through the prism of I'm an American, but I am somebody who lived all these years abroad, and so I come to it with some sense of a little bit more distance. And if I am sort of describing the American political scene that I was writing about before I went abroad. I mean, I interestingly interviewed Barack Obama back in 1999 when he was a law professor, before he got into the Senate. That period of politics that he was talking about then, I was a little wet behind the ears back then, but then you fast forward to the world that we're inhabiting now, and we are dealing with a different set of instruments, and trying to describe that adequately is a project. And I think we're just really sort of beginning to understand. It has to do with money in politics. It has to do with, obviously, information technology. But there are elements that are stressing the system in a profound way.
Yeah, well, our Prime Minister uses Facebook Live to talk directly to New Zealanders to get her message out. I can't see that stopping, and I think he's probably going to have to use those kinds of techniques to get there.
Yeah, it's interesting because he is, in some ways, Biden is a president who is not a product of the social media era. He's very much a kind of somebody who, I asked him about his social media habits one afternoon, and he said, well, I don't read a lot of the comments. If there's an important tweet, my staff will send it to me. And that is, I kind of like the mediating element of the stuff. I actually thought that sounded to me like a much healthier relationship with social media. I'd sort of like to come up with that arrangement myself.
Exactly.
So the place where I want to go now is just Biden's relationship with the Senate, and which you describe as being really essential to understanding the man. Could you take us through that journey of him starting as a brash 29-year-old about, really, you describe it more about presentation, to the end of his time in Senate, where he is a substantive leader in that chamber. But could you talk us through that journey?
It's really a fascinating one, because you have to remember, he came to the Senate at the lowest moment that a human being can have. His wife had just been killed in a car accident. His daughter had just been killed. And he didn't think he was going to take his seat, actually, and he considered suicide. And he was sort of persuaded to try it by a couple of these older senators, Mike Mansfield being one of them, Senate Majority Leader at that point. They came to him and they said, look, if you don't have something important to do every day, you are going to cave in on yourself, and you're not going to be a father to these two boys who you have surviving at home. Give it a try for 6 months. So he did that. And of course, it did sort of save him. It kind of became this period in his life in which, in his memory, the Senate was a deeply dignifying experience. It was a place in which people could disagree on fundamental political facts, but would provide this really elemental kind of support to one another, and so on. And after all, the political context at that point in 1973 was polarization was very low. There was a huge amount of ticket splitting. People would vote for the Democrat for president and the Republican for Congress, and so on. And there was a lot of bipartisan cooperation on the Senate floor. And all of that is over. And he ended up, so he rose up through the Senate, and he still had some of those habits of mind. There was a wonderful detail that he and John McCain, of course, who were very close, even though they were in opposite parties, they once, on a few occasions, they would sit together on the Senate floor. They would, sit in adjoining desks. And Biden remembers the day that his Senate leadership said to him, you can't do that anymore. It looks bad. It's not the spirit of the day. Don't do that. And McCain's leadership said the same thing to him. And it drove Biden nuts, because he said, hold on, what are we doing here? And I remember once, Biden was talking to me about the evolution of the Senate, how it had changed over the years. And he said, this is the most withering criticism he could possibly give of the Senate. He said, they're turning it into the House of Representatives. My God. So in a way, all of those kinds of slightly decorous old customs that were really a part of how the Senate functioned. Unanimous consent, filibuster was very rarely used until the end of the 1970s. All those kinds of things, they are now like, the Model T. They are just horse and buggy compared to where the Senate is and how it functions. And now he's coming in and being asked to drive in that race, to mix up our metaphors. But it's going to be a real question for him. And I spoke to President Obama over the summer as I was writing the book about this question, about how is Joe Biden going to contend with the Senate. And one of the things he said was that I think it's been painful for Joe. That was his word. Painful for Joe to part with that memory of what the Senate was. And there's real truth to that he's going to have to grieve and get on with it quite fast if he's going to hope to if he's going to not get bottled up and stymied in many ways like Obama was.
Yeah. And you don't see any. I mean, he has a relationship with Mitch McConnell.
They must know each other very well. So, is there
they
a
do,
relationship?
Actually, it is a real relationship. I mean, Mitch McConnell, in fact, is the only Republican senator who attended Beau Biden's funeral in 2015. The two of them have a relationship. It goes back to the days in the White House. In fact, there was that fateful moment. We were having this series of financial crises generated entirely by Congress. And one of them was the fiscal cliff. We were at risk of defaulting on U.S. debt. And the Obama administration couldn't reach a deal with McConnell. And McConnell placed a call over to Biden's office in the West Wing. And Biden picks up, and McConnell says, "Is there anybody over there who knows how to make a deal?" And the two of them started working on it and ended up striking a deal. Now, it was not a deal that Democrats love. Harry Reid, in fact, was said to have crumpled up the terms of it and throw it in the fireplace in his Senate office. I asked Harry Reid about that. He said, "Well, I didn't throw that in the fireplace, I don't think, but I threw a lot of things in the fireplace." But, I happen to think he did throw it in the fireplace. But so, Biden is able and willing and experienced in dealing with Mitch McConnell, but he is not a fantasist. He does not imagine that Mitch McConnell is going to wake up tomorrow and decide that it's in his political interest to help Biden succeed. So Biden's project is to try to figure out a way to make it in McConnell's interest. Find the deal space. That's the term that Biden uses, the deal space, and figure out a way for them to strike something meaningful.
Yeah, you talk about that Biden being motivated by finding the shared interest, and finding that deal space.
Yeah, I mean, that interest. I mean, this is something that applies also to his foreign affairs. I mean, I think I've traveled with Biden overseas, and one of the things that I've seen him do is that he has this really deeply held view that you can never tell another person, another negotiator, what his or her interests are. The moment you do that, it's over. It's lost. And one of the reasons why he sometimes clashes with American sort of professional diplomats is that he thinks that's what they want him to do. And so he'll often sort of abandon the talking points, and they'll roll their eyes at him because they say you weren't forceful enough, or you didn't do the thing we asked you to do. And he says, this is actually, I'm quoting him telling me about it. He says, because what you asked me to say was going to say to them, I think you're an idiot, and I don't think you're an idiot. And so in a way, he is trying to always understand what another person's political reality is. And that means understanding their interests, their specific political ecology that they're contending with.
Yeah. Do you have a follow-up there, Jan?
Oh, no, I think it's a really good point. I mean, the same complaints are made by Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials about foreign ministers here, that they don't stick to their talking points. But then the diplomats been around a long time noticed that at the end of the meeting, the deal was actually done that needed to be done. All the points were actually registered in a way that were registered. So, I think the fact that Biden has that it's incredible, really, because he started off as a young man, as somebody who was full of himself and a performer. And so he was talking so much he didn't have his ears on. And it seems now that he's really learnt that art of listening through years of political experience.
Though I will say, it's all true, and I sort of describe his listening capability. But I have full disclosure. The fact is, the man can still talk at considerable length. And any of our friends who are watching and listening today, when they find themselves in the room with him, will find that he is still an indefatigable talker. But what's interesting about it, and I mentioned this in the book, somebody who worked with him in the White House said to me, I would go down the hall, he would ask this source of mine to come brief him on various subjects. And this source would go down and they'd sit together. And after asking for a briefing, Biden would then talk for 90% of the time. But in the 10% that he was listening, he was actively listening. He was picking things up that he didn't know. He was building it into his analysis. And you would then see him deploy it in analytical terms, in useful ways. And that is actually relatively rare among people who reach the highest ranks in our system.
From reading what you've been writing about him, it seems to me that he's also reading your emotions when he's talking. So he's an empath who is understanding what's happening to the words as they're coming out in terms of
very much
his reaction. So
very much so.
So that's probably the number one skill. This is not on the agenda, but probably some of the toughest issues he's had to deal with was Anita Hill, and I don't know if that's resolved yet, but he was able to navigate it through the campaign. Did you discuss that with him in your sessions?
What I know about him and Anita Hill is not from him. It's from talking to people around him. It's not a subject that I've explored, but it's a really interesting one. I mean, it's one I can talk about. I mean, what I think is worth noting about the Anita Hill experience, what it tells us about his mindset was, and the kind of remind us what happened. Of course, this was a case in which he was presented with this very difficult situation. He has an African-American nominee to the Supreme Court, a Republican. He wants to make sure that he's giving that nominee a full and fair hearing. And at the same time, he is faced with the reality that Clarence Thomas was facing very serious criticism and accusations of sexual harassment. And Biden ended up making decisions that alienated women for a very long time by not allowing two other accusers to speak during the hearings. He told them to submit written statements, and that in the end was a mistake. On the eve of the campaign, you'll remember he called Anita Hill and gave a kind of half-hearted apology. And it was probably a missed opportunity, because what he could have done in that situation was put it behind him and said, look, I wish I had done this differently. I'm sorry that I didn't. What he said was, I'm sorry that you were treated the way you were. It was a sort of, passive tense solution. And what I think it reveals about him is that what I find over the years in talking to him about various episodes is that when he believes that his motives were the right motives at the time, he finds it hard to apologize for it. When he looks back on it and says, in fact, my motives were flawed, I was too arrogant, or I was too impatient, or I was this, then he'll say that was a mistake. But in that case, he believed that his motives were pure. He thought what he was doing was giving deference to what he thought was going to be a history-making addition to the Supreme Court. And in retrospect, he says, this is his word, I gave too much deference to the nominee, and I should have given more deference to his accusers.
Right. Yeah, that point around his ability to acknowledge, situations that weren't great. And you talk about that evolution of the man. You have this interesting framing where you start from the 1988 presidential election, tracking through to today, but you're starting from 1988, that disastrous campaign, and then through to 2020.
No one should use Neil Kinnock as inspiration.
That's right. but you're talking about it as a spectrum of humility, that this maturing of the character. What's going on there?
Yeah, I was clued into that by somebody who worked very closely with him, and still does, who's been helping me understand Joe Biden for a long time. And this person said that the truth is that it was really the death of Beau Biden in 2015 that, to use this person's language, it killed off the last bit of arrogance in Joe. And that can sound like tough language, except that it was really true. That in a way, what this person said was that was the last of the college football player we saw, where he emerged as this much more reflective, settled, kind of patient person who was a better listener. But that was not, it wasn't like just a phase shift. It really was the final chapter in this evolution. The first step was him acknowledging that the 88 race was a disaster because he had made mistakes. And then there was this other phase, this key moment in the kind of passage of humility that I think is worth mentioning, which is that when he was tapped to be vice president by Barack Obama, at first he thought, I should be in that job. I ran for it. He'd run in that race. And he thought, I'm more experienced. I'm a better man for the job. And in fact, he said as much to some of Obama's aides as he took the job. And then after a few months of watching Obama, watching the kind of seriousness that Obama brought to the office, just the sheer sort of precision and diligence, the fact that Obama got as expert on the details of the financial crisis as he was able to do in a few short months, Biden said to one of his advisors, David Axelrod, who told me the story, he said, look, actually, the truth is the best man won this race, and I'm honored to be able to serve him. And he ended up learning a lot from Obama. He learned some of that he learned to be a little bit more disciplined. And Obama learned how to be a little warmer, actually. And the two of them, interestingly, one of their advisors told me at one point, the reason why this partnership is a success is because each one thinks that he is the mentor to the other.
Yeah, I think the comparison is really interesting, and I'm going to intercept a question that Jordan's going to ask, which is about the relationship between Obama and Biden. But I spent a bit of time 3.5 years ago with President Obama, and I was, the pejorative is he's very professorial, but what I found was somebody who was extraordinarily disciplined, but also very analytical and controlled around how he made decisions and how he synthesized information, which seems to be quite the opposite to Biden. Do you think that the process of governing that is he's going to copy that, and which goes to the question you're going to ask, which is how will he interact with Secretary of State and other members of cabinet in terms of will he be using Obama processes or will he be using Joe processes?
Well, it's interesting. In a way, he did get some doctrine from Obama in the sense that, on a very practical level, Joe Biden had spent 36 years in the Senate without ever really needing to master the use of a teleprompter, because in the Senate, your language is measured more about quantity than quality, and nobody was paying all that much attention to what he said. He was, one of 100 senators. You get into the vice presidency, and it matters tremendously what you're saying, and even more so now in the presidency. And you see that these days, that he is not making the kinds of casual, off-the-cuff comments that he did 10 years ago or even 6 years ago. He is a more careful practitioner, as is Obama. Interestingly, when you talk to Obama now versus, when I met him back in his pre-Senate days, he was obviously much more kind of improvisational and so on. So I do think you're going to see that. That's a reflection of also Biden is a process guy. He believes in the importance of moving things through the interagency process. If we're talking about national security, he is contemptuous of the way the Trump administration has had essentially the kind of theater of National Security Council without the content of it, in the way that they just have not had the full process that previous administrations have had. And this is not me talking. This is former Republican national security officials who are frustrated by that process. And what I think you're likely to see is that Biden is going to be more disciplined in replicating some of that. What he's not going to do, I think, is probably have quite the same level of reserve from either from the public or from Congress. He loves Congress. Barack Obama never loved Congress, even when he was in it. And that is a difference. And so I think you're likely to see Biden being more engaging more explicitly with Congress, and at times he's also going to be he's going to be talking to the public in a way. It was a diplomat who was in the room with him once who said to me that there's an interesting phenomenon that when Biden and Obama are both in a room with a team of foreign diplomats, very often by the end of the meeting, the foreign diplomats are kind of leaning towards Biden just because of the nature of his human interaction. He's less forbidding than Obama was. So I think you're likely to see some of that.
Yeah, we had a briefing from Mark Gilbert, who was the U.S. ambassador to New Zealand for the Obama administration, and Mark talked about organizing a visit here with Joe Biden, and there was a very busy schedule, and Mark said, no, throw all that out. We're going to put aside 90 minutes for a roundtable with the Prime Minister, foreign policy officials, cabinet ministers, just to talk about the issues, and it went on for longer than 2 hours, and Joe talked, and people were leaning in, as you were describing, because his knowledge and how much he was prepared to share and explain across the whole gamut of issues in our region just demonstrated he was totally gripped up on it, and they were super impressed with him. So Mark's idea was, having known Joe Biden, was the exact thing that an ambassador should do. So, I think we've got our own experiences with the president that, he understands what's going on in the region. He's got a deep knowledge. Now, that cut across one of your questions too, didn't it? Which was about foreign policy.
Just ask another one.
So it leads us to foreign policy, Evan, and particularly your field of China, which is, and by the way, breaking news: the Supreme Court's not going to hear the Pennsylvania challenge by the Trump administration. So, so you get to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices, and they don't repay the favor. There's a small matter of law.
I have to say, I'm speaking to you right now, a mile from the White House, and the city has moved on. Donald Trump is currently still occupying the real estate, but he doesn't hold the job very much these days. No. He is a rather diminished figure already.
So I think that the campaign, he used the word to describe. He described Russia as an adversary and China as a competitor, which is, I think, a very clever use of the language, because it avoids the Cold War trap, but it also probably gives him more scope for putting more pressure on China than someone who's trying to defeat China, which is a loser's errand. So, how do you see competition in a Biden era, and how does that play out in terms of countries like New Zealand who live in the region?
Well, it's interesting because you remember when he started this campaign, he was still a little bit in the grip of an older view, which was, well, the U.S. and China can still cooperate fundamentally. We don't see each other as competitive. He got beat up a bit on the campaign trail when he said China's not a serious competitive threat to us. People said, "Well, what century are you living in? That's just not the case anymore." I happen to know what he was talking about because I've heard that language from him before. What he was getting at, and it'll be folks who follow the relationship will recognize some of this. What he was sort of saying was, look, they don't have a Silicon Valley. They don't have a culture of innovation of the kind that we have. But in shorthand, that sounded like he was not addressing the full scale of China's competitive strength. He doesn't use that language now. I think what he recognizes is that there is a serious, in fact, the defining competitive challenge for the United States, not one that we are guaranteed to prevail unless we take active steps, is presented by China. But his view, that one of the differences, I think the core difference with Trump, is that Trump's approach to that was this fairly, shall we say, kind of improvisational form of protectionism and rhetoric, while personally trying to make friends with Xi Jinping. And Biden doesn't believe in any of that. What he thinks is the way that we win this competition is by building a strong competitive economy in the United States by taking the necessary and quite obvious political steps to try to shore up America's manufacturing strength for a new economy, not try to revive what is an economy of another generation, and then hold China's feet to the fire on real issues like intellectual property theft, market access, and so on. But what I think is interesting is that the Biden administration is going to quite happily ride off of some of the residual energy left over by the Trumps, because they are going to inherit this set of tariffs in place, and just because they thought that it was probably not a wise move, they sure as heck aren't going to remove them right away. They're going to allow those things to stay in place until they can extract a reasonable price. And that's where you'll see a bit of, I think that's where a bit of the kind of maneuvering is going to play out, where you're going to have a Biden administration that said, we're going to be happy to get rid of these tariffs, but we can't do it because we have these folks over our shoulders telling us that we're going to be soft on China unless we get something for it. So the ball is in your court, Beijing. You have to give us something real. And we know the difference between real and fake. Don't tell us you're going to buy a bunch of soybeans and that's the end of it. It's time for movement. I find in my encounters these days with Chinese friends and analysts that they recognize what's happening. This is about to be the beginning of the return of a more informed diplomacy, and that's harder to deal with.
Yeah, and more consistent. And I think, too, that you've got the Senate and the Congress lined up. And the question, in some ways, the House has been leading some of the policy development in this space. Do you think that Biden will want to get ahead of that or work more collaboratively with the House in terms of the China competition strategy?
I think, he will use it when it's valuable to him. I think he is wary. I can tell you, look, the people around him especially, and the key person on this to watch is Jake Sullivan, the incoming national security advisor. Jake has written publicly about his views on China and how his views have evolved. He's become more hawkish, to use the shorthand. But it's smart hawkish. I mean, he sees that we're going to need China on various issues like climate, for instance. What I don't expect the Biden administration to do is to get drawn into some of the more primitive forms of xenophobic sentiment that percolates through both the House and some of the Senate these days, that is essentially just substituting China into the old Cold War analogies. And that is not a strategy. I mean, the idea that we're going to contain China or is not a realistic reflection of the level of economic interdependence that we're in. This, speaks to New Zealand's situation, that, in a sense, the United States, if it's being honest, has tremendous reasons to want to have a robust economic relationship with China. We are at this moment opening a Starbucks in China every 5 hours. This is not immaterial for us. Just, go talk to Elon Musk about his economic linkages with China. He's built, obviously, enormous manufacturing capability in Shanghai. So what I think we're likely to see is certainly a tougher American approach than there was under the Obama administration. No question about that. But it's not going to be driven by quite the same political opportunity and ideology that you see under the Trump administration.
I read your article in the New Yorker, and it really went through sector by sector, if that's the term to use, and looking at what's going to happen in each sector, whether it's trade or the South China Sea and all those issues. When it comes to the economic and trade, the big issue obviously is data, because there's no doubt that bifurcation's underway. China is starting to publish its own standards around export controls and the standards around what they expect to do on data. They differ from what the US wants, and probably they also differ from what New Zealand would expect around data privacy and all those sorts of protection of people's privacy. And you can see it in economy, in businesses in our country, is having to choose, okay, where am I going to sell, which system am I going to sell into, and how am I going to navigate that? So I worry that data actually just trumps it all, to use the term, and is so pervasive across every sector that that we're not going to make progress unless there's some way of navigating that issue. Do you have a view on that?
Well, I can tell you that the way you described it is consistent with how Beijing thinks of it now. They think they have a strong hand when it comes to the future of geoeconomic dominance.
AI and all that stuff.
And what they say is, look, if the 20th century was about the natural resources that you pump out of the ground, the 21st century is going to be about the data resources that you generate from your population. And we just simply have a larger resource. We are the Saudi Arabia of data, of AI, of biodata, of all of the kinds of things that will become valuable. I think that is certainly true, indisputably true. But it matters a lot on how the rest of the world thinks about the reliability and trustworthiness of China as a technology partner. And, one of the things that the Trump administration did that is going to be important for the Bidens is, what do you do about Huawei? And it's less about one specific company than it is about essentially a period in the relationship when you're going to be dealing with that issue over and over again. How and when should a Chinese company be given access? And what are they doing with the data? I think the key point here is that they're not going to be doing it alone. That was the strategic mistake that the Trump administration never figured out how to solve, was that they had embarked on this posture of America first, which in effect meant which was quite alienating to a lot of our allies. And as a result, we found it very hard to do collective action. The Biden administration is not going to be dealing with quite that problem. So I think what you're likely to see is, and you're beginning to hear just sort of flickers of this from some of Biden's advisors, is a world in which they go out to, call it what you want, the D10 or the democracies that are interested in being close to the United States, and they say, let's talk about ways in which we can set standards of our own when it comes to the use of data in the world. These are not, solving the technical problems of which systems do you buy, but they are at least setting out a clearer choice between an American regime of technology and a Chinese regime of technology. And I don't think you're going to see the Biden administration shying away from that kind of clarity.
So plurilateralism to get progress in that area, we can expect that, and that we'll have to respond to that when the Biden administration's ready. I think that is, it's a different challenge to the previous administration and how we navigate those issues. Yeah. I think I wouldn't be a responsible foreign policy geek and a New Zealander unless we talked about trade. And so if you look in Asia with the US. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, Obama put a lot of effort into it at the end of his 8 years. And so it never bedded in, and it was the first thing that Trump got rid of. But it just seemed, from a geostrategic point of view, just such a logical thing. The US does not seem to have an economic strategy in Asia. Biden has supported free trade in the past, and it seems, the CPTPP, or whatever it needs to be called, is that something that we have any reason to be optimistic in the near term? And by the near term, I mean the next 3 years, that there'll be progress out of the US on this stuff?
I can't speak to the specific trade deals and where he's likely to invest his energy or the sort of priority, but I think as a general matter, what he believes in, what we could call kind of revised free trade. So he's not a protectionist, but he also doesn't believe that the system as it was functioning right up until January of 2017 was doing enough for Americans. I mean, I think he's come to terms with that. And, one of the things you hear from him as a candidate, but really also now in transition, is when he talks about build back better, that slogan, that's actually, there's some real depth to it. What they're really saying is that the way that we're going to succeed is by acknowledging that we were on autopilot for some of these things. And, but I think, a lot of people in this incoming administration were sincere intellectual architects of the TPP. they have not walked away from that idea, and they have not walked away from the idea that countries should figure out fundamentally how to maximize their respective strengths. And that means that I think you're likely to see them fundamentally return to the era of free trade, but it's not going to be what it was before.
So Trump kept the unions on side when he did NAFTA 2.0. The other one's unpronounceable. And so the question is, do you think Joe Biden will be able to reach to those unions and get them on side for the things he needs to do in that area?
I don't know. I think it will probably be case by case. I think, there has been so much of this is cultural now, Leon. It's even more than just, the specifics of one trade deal or another. I mean, Trump's ability to kind of win over the unions as a sort of sector of American cultural life is amazing, because so few of his policies were in fact advancing the interests of their membership. By the same token, though, I think if Biden is in through other ways, and you have seen him make pretty serious gestures to say we're going to do things that help the unions at home, make it easier for them to unionize, that they're going to be pushing back. I'd say you can count on the fact that the Biden Justice Department is going to be more aggressive on monopolies than the Trump Justice Department was. Those kinds of things may end up changing the chemistry more than an individual trade deal or not. So I think we have to wait and see a little bit on whether or not he can shift the tone that way.
So, Jordan, I've been dominating the last wee while.
Yeah. No, great questions. One question, and it's a step back from the trade discussion and the more specific discussion around China, but perhaps the answer is China. I mean, what is your sense around his priorities on the international front? I mean, there's talk around, and you mentioned the D10, but democratic allies working together on a number of in a number of areas. There's climate change. But where do you see him directing things?
I think that before anything else, it's COVID, 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 and COVID. And that's the reality, that we are so crippled right now. And, I say this, today I was on the phone with a friend of mine in New Zealand. I have friends there who are, we're all living right now in another dimension from what we're going through here. And we say this with the highest of admiration. We are dazzled and envious with the ability to go on with your lives. And we're not there yet. And before Biden can do anything else, he has to mop up this terrible mess that's been left by the failure to address the pandemic. And I mentioned that in answer to your question about foreign priorities, because it is as much an international issue as it is a domestic issue. So when he says on day one that I'm rejoining the WHO, that's only partly about making a gesture of multilateralism. It is also a functional reality that he believes that we're not going to keep ourselves safe and address this unless we're dealing with it in a cooperative way. The United States just made the mistake of not buying enough vaccine doses from Pfizer. I mean, the number of mistakes that they're going to have to deal with is going to really limit what he can do on the international scene. But I will say one thing very clearly. I think he is the idea that governs everything else will be the restoration of American credibility. And that means not going to trade wars with, he didn't quite go to a trade war with his allies, but he came close. I mean, really sort of undermining the confidence of South Koreans and Europeans and others who should believe that they have essentially a close relationship with us. Biden's going to be talking to them about who we are and what we stand for. And then all the obvious things. Of course, he's going to restore, America's participation in the Paris Climate Agreement. He's going to be doing climate in a serious way, but nothing else is possible until he deals with the virus.
Evan, you've got quite a profile here. You've been talking to Kim Hill from Radio New Zealand, who's probably got the biggest audience for current affairs and politics and foreign affairs and science. You've I just love what you write. I think history's found you in the right spot to be the analyst that can deal with all the big issues, and also your book has the benefit of having President-elect Biden having won the election. So on behalf of the NZ-US Council, we're going to use this and promote this throughout our networks so that people can get themselves ready for the next phase of our relationship with the United States. So thank you so much for your time. We really value it, don't we, Jordan?
Absolutely. I've loved this session.
He's the fanboy.
I have to say, this was a thrill for me. It's great fun to be with you. I'm a big fan of New Zealand. Loved my visit there and looking forward to my next one.
We want to host you down here. I think we need to talk about getting you down here and having a tour that we'll host.
Hear, hear. Well, I'll look forward to it.
Thank you very much.